Well, joining me today is John Cohen, who is an expert on what's happening in America with gun violence, especially these mass shootings. And the first question I wanted to ask you, John, is during your studies, when you've looked at all of the kinds of factors, I think people in rural America tend to think, well, it can't happen here. This is an El Paso, this is a Dayton, this is a Tucson problem. It's not a problem that we would experience in Fargo or in Bismarck or even in so when you look at it, do you think any place in this country is really immune from the kind of problems that we're seeing right now with gun violence?
No, I think unfortunately, particularly as it relates to mass shootings, we are not only in the midst of a multi-year trend in which we're experiencing an increase in mass shootings, but when examining them, we see that they're not limited to any specific geographic area. So they're not just occurring in big cities. We're seeing these types of shootings occur in small towns, rural areas, suburban areas, and urban areas. So, and it really has to do with the dynamics of the shooter versus the geographic location where the shooter is located. But no, the sad fact is that as we sit here today and are having this discussion, these types of attacks can occur anywhere.
Well, and the other point that I think we should make is that in rural America, there's kind of an immediate reaction to a complete focus being on gun legislation. Not saying rural America is necessarily opposed to additional restraints and additional background checks, but I am saying that in a place where you see a large number of guns and you also see people who feel very strongly that they may be 40, 50 minutes away from the nearest law enforcement officer, and so they feel compelled to secure a weapon for their own security, they are really looking for solutions. They're really looking for what's created this dynamic. How do we solve this? And in our conversation, John, that the interesting thing I think that you bring to this is your awareness of who these shooters are and how we can maybe do a better job of prevention if we know the dynamic of the shooter themselves. And so in your studies, can you kind of give me what you think is a pretty generalized profile of a shooter who would engage in mass shooting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is work that I was involved in while I was at the Department of Homeland Security back in 2012, 13, 14 timeframe. And we started seeing a shift in the threat environment. Prior to that point, our primary concern from a mass shooting or mass casualty attack perspective was the threat posed by individuals who were recruited or inspired, but primarily recruited by foreign terrorist organizations. They were trained, indoctrinated, prepared, and dispatched by a foreign terrorist organization to conduct an attack in this country. And in the 2014 timeframe in particular, we started to see a shift. And after leaving the Department of Homeland Security, I've been working with the FBI and others to really gain a better understanding of why we're seeing an increase in mass shootings in the United States and what are the behavioral characteristics of the shooters. And what we found is that for the most part, and I would also say probably almost without exception, whether the shooter is motivated by some extremist ideology or by some personal grievance, these shooters tend to share common behavioral characteristics. They tend to be disaffected, socially disconnected, individuals who feel that their lives have been a failure. They tend to come from dysfunctional families. They're angry, and that anger causes them to search across different platforms accessible through the internet and find some cause or grievance that gives them the justification to express that anger through violence. And so the way we kind of frame it in a shortened way is it's not the ideology, it's the psychology. And yes, terrorist and extremist groups have taken an understanding that this population of people are out there and have used social media to inspire people to conduct attacks on behalf of their cause. But for the most part, these are individuals who are angry, who want to express that anger through violence. They spend a lot of time online. They connect with a cause, or they formulate a grievance in their mind, and then independent of any organization, they go out and commit a mass shooting or mass casualty attack.
Well, when we look at it, obviously the two things that get said as this issue becomes politically polarized are, on one side, it's all about the guns. On the other side, it's about video games. It's about mental health. And what we really know in all of this is it is so much more complicated than I think the politics of today are really addressing. And so I want to talk about kind of some of these proposed solutions, and one of which is video games. When you look at the profiles that you've done of these shooters, do you see a radicalization or a increased anger level as a result of video games?
Well, what we've seen, I don't know if it's as a result, and I think you raise a really interesting point, because what we've learned, it's not just one factor, it's a combination of factors. So while most of these shooters tend to be mentally unwell, and many of them have diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues, this isn't simply a mental health problem. While a number of these shooters use firearms to commit their attacks, this isn't a problem that's just going to be solved by background checks. So there's a number of factors that come together, and it's important to understand that, because if we're going to stop these attacks, we have to have a greater understanding of the totality of circumstances surrounding an individual, and assess whether on an individual basis this person poses a risk. So to your question specifically, we have found that in almost every case, these individuals spend an incredible amount of time online looking at extremist material, looking at material regarding past shootings, reading and immersing themselves in hate-filled rhetoric that's accessible online, and they tend to spend a lot of time playing video games. And now, whether that's a causal factor or just an indicator is a separate issue. But there are neurologists that we've spoken to who consider that immersing yourself in a highly stimulating sensory environment that's very violent could potentially impact brain structure. And we know that using video games can have positive effects on learning and socialization. There hasn't been, quite frankly, a lot of study to determine whether the opposite is true, whether extensive use by people with certain types of characteristics of these video games can actually be a negative factor. So it's an area that requires more study, but it is a common characteristic amongst these shooters that they do spend a lot of time in these games, and they equate to some degree the actual physical act of shooting as being a part of a game. We know some of these shooters have actually talked about getting a higher score than past mass shooters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's fair to say that the jury is out on video games, but to simply point the finger and say that's the problem, and if only we would curtail the violence in video games, that would solve the problem. I think for every mother who had a son or a daughter who played these games who have not had this reaction to them, we kind of can poo-poo that. One of the concerns that I have about the focus on mental health is, number one, in North Dakota, a place that people care deeply about their gun rights. One of the things I discovered when I was Attorney General was that people would almost do anything that they could to avoid losing their gun rights, whether that was going to jail for a misdemeanor as opposed to pleading guilty to a felony, which would have automatically suspended their ability to secure a firearm and to go hunting, for instance. So when you look at it, one of the concerns that I have is that if we say, okay, everybody who has a diagnosis of a bipolar disease or depression, that is going to automatically go into a database, and you're going to be denied gun rights. the reaction in states like North Dakota may be, I'm not going to seek treatment for my mental health. And so I think we have to be really careful in all of this that we don't engage in the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as we've looked at this issue, again, I don't come at this from a political perspective. I've worked for Democrats, I've worked for Republicans. I'm a gun owner. I understand and support the Second Amendment. But I also am a strong believer, having been a law enforcement professional for 35 plus years, that if we assess somebody to be high risk of conducting an act of violence, that there should be steps that should be taken in an appropriate way that restrict that person's access to firearms during that period where they're deemed to be high risk. And there are states that have employed techniques that do that quite effectively. I mean, just on a personal note, I live here in Maryland. My son goes to a high school. There was some post that a former student put onto Instagram suggesting that he was going to conduct a shooting at that high school. The students who saw the post went to a school resource officer and showed those posts to that school resource officer. The threat management unit of the police department, which has mental health professionals and specially trained police officers, conducted what they call a threat assessment investigation, which basically looks at that individual from the perspective of are they a high risk? And then they were able to use the state's red flag laws to restrict that person's access to firearms while that person received treatment and the underlying issues were addressed that made that person a danger to society at that time period. And so it's a combination of skill sets, right? And it's a combination of capabilities. It's people coming forward and reporting suspicious activities. It's local law enforcement working with mental health professionals to have the capability of understanding whether somebody is, because of the totality of circumstances, a high risk of committing an act of violence. It's having the resources and capabilities to address the underlying issues that may be driving that person towards violence. Maybe it's working with the family, with the school system, with mental health professionals, with social service providers. And then it's a continual reassessment so that you can make a determination whether the risk posed by that person is increasing or whether that risk is decreasing. And you don't have to be so concerned about it. This is not a complicated thing to do. It's being done in a growing number of jurisdictions around the country. And there are attacks that have been stopped because of this focus on risk management versus simply making it an arrest and prosecution. But the trouble with Washington right now is that we are so politically polarized and you can't even have the discussions on Capitol Hill or within the executive branch to begin framing the problem this way and taking steps so that the federal government can support these local efforts. And that's what's most disappointing to me, is that we haven't been able to break free of our tribal, political, polarized relationships in order to address a problem that law enforcement officials that I'm talking to at the national level believe is the primary threat facing Americans today from a mass violence perspective.
Yeah, it is absolutely incredible how everybody goes to their rhetoric, everybody goes to their corner, and they want to fight the battle based on their lens of what the problem is. And we know that over the years, and here's another huge challenge, that there have been restrictions placed on entities like the Centers for Disease Control in studying this as a public health problem. There have been laws passed in states like Florida, which were eventually overturned on First Amendment grounds, saying a doctor could not discuss eliminating firearms from a home if he saw these warning signs or she saw these warning signs. And so we've got to get out of the lens of looking at this simply from the political perspective and start analyzing this from evidence-based, law enforcement proven strategies that can prevent this. Now, I have a question. I don't know if you're familiar with the work or with Andrew Ross Sorkin did an article for the New York Times after a long period of study on looking at what we could find out from looking at credit card purchases. because when you go back and take a look at the shooters, they don't tend to pay cash for this level of weapons and armor and ammunition. They tend to put it on a credit card, and for every one of the shooters that he analyzed, he saw this massive amount of charges, and maybe not all in just one gun store. That was unique and definitely indicated a challenge or an arming of these individuals. Have you looked at kind of engaging with the credit card companies and with the financial institutions to track kind of purchasing trends that would alarm anyone who was looking at this, or is that something that hasn't hit the radar yet?
No, but we have, and you raise an excellent point. So I was trained, as a police officer, I was trained, if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand the problem. And if there's any good news in all of this, is that through the work of the Secret Service and the FBI and state and local law enforcement analysts, we have a really good understanding not only of the current threat environment, the behavioral characteristics of these shooters, and the behaviors they exhibit prior to conducting an attack through the various stages as they go from the stage of anger to actual violent attack. And to your point, they don't fly under the radar. They exhibit behaviors that are observed by people who interact with them, family members, coworkers, people who go to school with them, or behaviors that they exhibit online through their social media and other, internet activities that are apparent to people. So the question is, what more do we have to do to document those behaviors, train the public or educate the public what to look for, and then train law enforcement to look at all of those indicators as they assess risk. So industry, this is going to require a different interaction with industry. Social media companies, for example, have been very resistant to allow law enforcement to examine material on their platforms as part of efforts to detect individuals who may be exhibiting behaviors associated with these types of threats. Credit card companies haven't really thought about this from the perspective of how transactions on their networks or transaction through their infrastructure may be pre-incident indicators. So I think the first step is we have to educate the public and police, but the second part of this is then working with industry to find ways that allow greater access. The other thing we haven't even gone into yet is these free speech implications. So as we develop a national approach to dealing with these issues, we can't forget that sometimes things that are posted online, which may seem threatening, is protected speech. So there's a lot of sort of challenges in not only recalibrating the system so we're better able to prevent these types of attacks, but working with industry to make sure that they're a part of the solution as we do so.
If I can do an illustration on working with social media companies, we did a analysis of where human trafficking was occurring, and as a result, we saw incredibly bad behavior on the part of Backpage.com. We were allegedly prevented from curtailing that behavior or holding the people on Backpage accountable because they said this is a free speech issue. We spent a lot of time working this issue to try and find that lane that would address just the bad behavior, the criminal behavior, and not infringe on First Amendment rights. And, it can be done is my point. We passed SESTA. It worked pretty well. We shut down Backpage as a result of this. And so there's ways that we can do this. When people throw up their hands and say, can't be done, First Amendment, Second Amendment, that's absolutely not true. Where there's a will, there's a way. We can respect people's constitutional rights, but also protect the public. And I think the public has an expectation that we're going to do this. But if we simply say it's about video games and mental health, or on the other side, it's about access to guns, we will miss the real challenge here kind of going forward, I think. And so I just really, really applaud the work that you're doing. I wish everybody in America could hear this discussion so that they could feel like, yes, there are professionals out there who are addressing this from a professional standpoint, from an evidence-based standpoint, and we can in fact solve this problem. I think, I don't just think about the kids out there who are terrified to go back to school now. I don't just think about the mothers who are worried about sending their sons or daughters to school or to church or to, Walmart. I worry about the mom who's sitting there saying, can my son be one of these people? And what does she do? And what can she do to engage both the mental health or the healthcare system, but also engage the law enforcement system to basically sound the alarm? I mean, we've seen this over and over again, and maybe you can, with the last few minutes we have remaining, comment on kind of those early signals. Parkland, we knew that this was a very troubled individual. The Gabby Giffords shooter, basically, his parents knew, in fact, disabled his car, which is why he went to the shopping mall in a taxi. I mean, it's not the mother in the El Paso shooting now saying, look, she called and said, what can I do about him buying this level of weapons? And so I think that what we have to do is the people who are closest to someone who now has this sense, could my son or daughter or my husband or my best friend be somebody who would commit this act? What do I do if I suspect this? And I think that's a really critical question, because if you're going to get people to come forward, on the see something, say something kind of vein, you've got to give them the education and the mechanism to know that it's going to be treated appropriately.
Right, and that's the key issue, right? I get phone calls pretty regularly from people just like you described. They're concerned about one of their loved one or somebody at work. They call the local police, and the response they get from the local police or sheriff's department is that, unless they break the law, there's really nothing we can do. Or the police will respond to what we used to call a check the welfare call, which basically a uniformed police officer shows up and says, do you feel like hurting yourself? Do you feel like hurting somebody else? And if the person says no, they clear the call. So, I think what we've seen is family members tend to pick up on when their loved one is heading towards perhaps a crisis. And the Secret Service and the FBI call an important phase in the discovery process of potential shooters. They call it leakage, which is basically an articulation of intent by the individual preparing to commit a crime. Where we really need to focus the attention, and where I'm hoping that the administration will begin to focus more resources on, is getting the training out to state and local law enforcement, helping state and local community, or helping local communities establish the capacity by bringing together law enforcement and mental health professionals in a working relationship, so that when the mother or the father or the brother and the sister do pick up the phone and make that difficult call to law enforcement, that law enforcement takes in that information, a risk assessment is completed, and if that person's at high risk of committing an act, a threat management strategy is put in place to reduce the risk that that person will go in and commit a mass shooting. That's where we need to be focusing our attention. And I'm just to close, I'm just so concerned that the political environment here in Washington is going to stand in the way of us taking not expensive steps, steps that don't cost a lot of money, but could have a tremendous impact in reducing the chance that this type of shooting will occur in the next, in the future. So that's where I hope we'll devote our attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but that the epidemic of suicide in this country is not without its kind of overhang here. And by that I mean, when I was Attorney General, we treated every homicide as a potential suicide. So what we saw repeatedly, especially in domestic violence situations, was someone who would do something so heinous and so horrible, but also with the intent of committing suicide at the same time. And so when people look at gun violence and they say, well, that's suicide, that's not homicide, I just want to say, don't disconnect those two issues, because we really do need to look at this whole epidemic of gun violence in a broad kind of holistic approach. And you have to include the propensity towards suicide in that analysis, in my opinion.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been recent studies that have illustrated that people are angry and people are lonely, and that I don't think there's any. I think there's a relationship between the fact that we are an angry, lonely society and we're seeing an increase in this type of attack. And one of the factors that we find to be present in every single mass shooting is that these are people who are looking for a sense of social connection, people who are looking for a sense of life meaning, and in a perverse way, conducting a mass murder on behalf of some cause or grievance gives them that sense of purpose and meaning. And we really need to understand that if we're going to be successful in taking steps to address this growing threat.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about it. I hope that you stay engaged. I hope that you use every platform you can to get your message out. Because
we'll do it
my
together.
fear is, I'm with you, because my fear is that everybody will grab for that kind of ideological ring that suits their kind of lens, their political talking points, and we will miss the forest for the trees. And important work has been done by you and many of your colleagues in law enforcement to address the kind of overall dynamic of what's happening here. And if that work gets ignored, to just simply do the quick, easy thing, we will not solve this problem. And so keep talking, John. Thank you so much. I think your analysis is so critical. It's so important. I think that we need to turn this problem around and look at it from every angle, whether it is financial services, what can they tell us on early indication? What can mental health professionals tell us? What can we tell a doctor who's concerned that their patient might do this? What can we tell a mother who's concerned? And how can we respect the rights of individuals? And I'm talking about both First and Second Amendment rights of individuals, but also protect the rights of our population to live in a society that is free of gun violence. And so we don't have all the answers, but there is a lot more known than what people think. And there's a lot of things, as you said, that can be done that won't cost a lot of money, but they will integrate a lot of professionals in solving this problem together. And so thanks, John. I look forward to ongoing discussions with you. And I just want everybody who listens to our One Country Hot Dish podcast to know that this is not a big city problem exclusively. This is something that can happen in rural America. And some of the solutions, when John was going through the discussion of what happened in your Maryland high school, I thought, number one, the high school in Bowman, North Dakota, doesn't have a resource officer, doesn't have the integration that you're talking about. And so we're going to have to come up with different kinds of solutions and different strategies for rural America. And so we want to put that on the table as well.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you so much for having me on. It was nice talking with you about this important issue. And I think if we can keep getting it out there, that we do know a lot, and there are things that we can do. Perhaps the public will demand that our leaders take action that actually help address this problem.
Yeah, I don't know anyone in the public who looks at this and goes to necessarily the simplistic solution.
Yep.
There are things that we can do on all sides if we have the political will, and if people, kind of come together in good faith to really address gun violence in America. Thanks so much, John, for being on.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you all will follow us on Twitter at _One Country, all one word, _, or join us on the internets at onecountryproject.org.